Good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happenstance into this Truth Bomb Riff. My name is Patrick Lovell, and we are recording this on, I think it's Monday, July 28th, 2025, approximately, let's call it 2:36 Eastern Time. And I'm joined by my longtime friend, compatriot, comrade, alliance in truth, gentleman by the name of Eric S. Vaughn, who is the anchor of a fabulous execution on YouTube and Instagram and some other places you can check out. It's called Corruption Incorporated: The American Way. And the reason I just happened to throw this, link to you on the fly without any setup, Eric, is because I think you and I have to have a quick conversation about the state of affairs. And I want to start with just simply what we all know to be what's happening around us, i.e., Epstein, completely, right?
Right.
And what I'm seeing in a monumental way, it's interesting and also very revealing and very disgusting at the same time. And I'm talking about more than just the smut of old men, and what they do with teenagers, which is horrible enough. But the entirety of this situation, from Donald Trump trying to turn the switch the blame and implicate, lie, deny, switch the blame and implicate, try to indict Obama and the Democrats for documentation, fraud, forgeries to frame him, and this being all an elaborate setup in context to just other ridiculous stuff. But also, Eric, in addition to, for example, what I'm seeing in mainstream media, right, and by default, the algorithm, everybody is talking, no matter what side of the scenario they're on, is the cover up, first and foremost. Some are asking questions about the money, and a lot of really intriguing questions have been starting to evolve. And I'm actually in conversations with some pretty connected people that I'm going to reveal here soon, but I'm going to kind of just, set you up with this first, and then I'm going to finish the thought. But I want you to kind of just, from where you're sitting, maybe address all of these things, given what we know, right? And the magnitude of the algorithm is such that first I hear everybody addressing, we got to hear from the victims. We got to hear their stories. We've got to really dive and understand what's happened. Now, I remind you that this is 20 years after the fact, but it's obviously very relevant. Everybody wants to talk about it. Everybody wants to know the details. And I think the algorithm
Right.
reveals that, sorry, sex sells. That's my interpretation, even though it's very valid to talk about what had happened 20 years ago. Because, I see these people that are victims of this scenario on mainstream media saying, look, I've been trying to get people's attention for over 3 decades on this stuff, and nobody would listen. And now one is suing the Department of Justice and the government and other things. And I don't know exactly how or why. It's certainly not going to be a key TAM. But that, and also context. So I covered just the reaction in general, the follow the money, and ultimately the relevancy of this whole thing in context to documentation fraud, for example. So when you see all of this stuff in the middle of you running a business and other incredible things that you're in, and I'll plug quickly, you're doing a fundraiser, not a fundraiser, it's a gathering, an amazing gathering of a new documentary series that you and your squad are putting together called The Heart of Rock and Roll, which I hope to be a part of as well. And I've got plenty of things going on. But that being aside, when you hear me say all of these things, given everywhere we've been, given everything that we've seen, how do you register this and in what order?
Boy. Well, the lurid aspects of the Epstein story is, of course, the thing that grabs people's attention, right? That's what makes everybody go, "Hmm?" And I don't think that's anything new. I mean, I think that I think the historical record, you go and look at artifacts and what have you, and I think that, people are people. And, we respond emotionally to the snake brain type of thing. And that's just what kind of naturally, grabs us. That being said, I think that the better parts of our humanity is the stuff that's able to break free from that. The more frontal lobe, limbic system, type aspects, and those are the parts that typically are ignored, by media, right? I mean, you have something that's very thoughtful, that's very genuine, it's very authentic. But it's sans the sex and violence. It's always going to take a back seat to something that has sex and violence forward, and that's an unfortunate thing. But also I think a statement of just where we are, just as a, I don't know, it's like on one hand as a society, but also, like I said, I mean, this is in time immemorial. But I think that if you're able to break away from those purely lurid aspects and be able to engage, the shall we say, the more civilized parts of your brain, the much more problematic things. Well, I don't want to say that. A whole other set of problematic things rise to the surface. And those problematic things are things that don't just affect, tragically the lives of these young people who were affected, by this trafficking, scheme that Epstein was a part of, which is horrible in and of itself for all the other reasons. But I think what it was for, because what we have to remember, I think, is that this whole Epstein story isn't the end of the road. It was a means to something else. And that's something else, which is what we're kind of looking at and going after, because the follow the money aspect of it, right? And and how it ties to power, and how power, uses these lurid aspects, and these, I hate the term, but in spycraft parlance, honey traps, you know, type of situations, that compromise, people in order to get something from them. So on one hand, it's enough of a scandal just because of the innocent people who were hurt by it. But if you look beyond that, the other part of this is that that was a means to a financially greater end, I guess would be one way of putting it. And that's the part that tends to be ignored because everybody's worried about the sex scandal aspects of this. Well, that was just a tool to get something from these people who were involved. This list, in whatever form it might actually exist, is a list of people whom another set of people wanted to compromise in order to either protect something or to get something from them. And I think that that's the part that I think is not being given enough attention, though it's starting to. And I think that that's one of the things that I think that from like what you do and what, with Corruption Inc., where we have like, where we have the ability to look at things from like a 60,000 point view, 60,000 foot view, and be able to say, okay, this was a means to an end. What was that end? And what is the scandal there? And I think that that's sort of how I've been looking at, this Epstein story as it continues to unfold.
Yeah, I thought you addressed that very well, and thoughtful, but I want to go further, to kind of reframe. One of the elements
Mhm.
that I had suggested to you was to comment based on what our journey has revealed. And you and I have learned so much together over the years. It's unbelievable. But I feel like we're like, Neo in the Matrix watching this stuff unfold in slow motion because there's
Oh
almost
yeah.
a pattern. There's a step by the numbers, but you've got,
Well,
as we
well,
both
this
know.
whole Epstein story, I'm sorry, isn't any different than the parties that Lincoln Financial was throwing all the way back in the SNL all the way back in the SNL period. Same damn thing for the same reason, right? And so what Epstein is, as horrific as it is nothing remotely new. And I think that's something that the work that we've done together has shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is a time-tested pattern. You get a bunch of rich people into a room, you get embarrassing, compromising media, based on them, hold on to it and basically use that in order to control them or to keep them from saying anything. I mean, it's a game plan that's ancient.
Right. But what you and I have learned, among other things, is the financial paradigm, the perverse incentives. And that's not to turn a phrase. I mean, that's literally the notion, the perverse incentives. And we can bake it into what we call control fraud that we've learned from William K. Black, and what that means. But the nature of compromise, okay, the reason I was setting that up for you, though, by way of a again, I want to kind of have you address just the elements of Epstein are 20 years old.
Mhm.
Okay, longer than 20 years old, quite frankly. But it's like it's got everybody's attention, and it's a big deal, especially the deal of follow the money that maybe we'll go into in a minute here. That's to me, I mean, as much as like the salacious part and old guys, taking advantage of vulnerable young people by dangling money and power and access and all that kind of stuff. That's been going on forever, and it is sickening. And yeah, boy, did we see a lot of that. And let's not forget that was P Diddy's whole freaking nature of freak offs. Okay, but forever I've been using these sorts of analogies long before a lot of this stuff came to light, going way back before Weinstein, for example. Right. And as we went through our process, what we started figuring out, because we'd lived through a lot of this stuff as well. Trust me, I know I've seen my fair share of strange things, right? Or stranger things, but that was just part of the culture growing up in the 80s and the 90s in a lot of ways. Or, sorry, we used to think of it as just part of the culture.
Right.
but, but I mean, it's like been there, done that, seen some crazy things, right? But not to the level of what we're seeing here. Not to confuse things. But the point that I'm trying to get to is the systemic nature of manipulation through perverse incentives that use all sorts of variables and methodologies of deception, but particularly, as we've both heard over the course of the last 6 months from David K. Johnson, who has done prolific work as it relates to decades of Donald Trump being involved with thousands of pieces of documentation, fraud, and falsification of
Right,
business
right.
records. And that, what in context to what we know, I mean, try to plug that all in as you see this stuff
Well,
unveil itself.
right, right. Well, I mean, 20 years ago, I mean, conspicuously, what period of time is that? That is right in the midst of the run up to 2008, right? So let's also like put a little bit further context. This is after the dot-com, bubble era. This is after Enron. But maybe more importantly, this is after long-term capital management and all of the basically the deregulation that was happening under the Clinton administration, right? I mean, which was, of course, a continuation of everything that Bush was doing, which is a continuation of everything that Reagan was doing, which all got kicked off in the Carter administration. So, once again, this is bipartisanship in the worst possible way, right? And here we are. But you go back 20 years when this stuff was happening, well, this is when all of the technology that was being implemented to create the financial crisis was at full bloom, right? I mean, look at the rise of AmeriQuest and the rise of Countrywide and the rise of all these non-bank lenders. When was that? Late 90s, early 2000s. It was 20 years ago. So if there's a person who is like squarely in the middle of high finance, dealing with decision makers in both government and corporate America, in the midst of the run up to the 2008 financial crisis, when we were having this frenzy, right, of mortgage fraud, this frenzy of mortgage-backed securities, CDOs, and synthetic CDOs, and everything else that comes with it. Although those came a tiny bit later. Um, but it was the environment that was creating and inventing these financial instruments, right? You know that whatever deals that they were making, whatever was happening, that they decided to have this trap of an island and these parties in New York and these parties in Florida and all this other stuff. You know that, I mean, just by the timing of it. you know that an awful lot of that had to have been the exact same financial instruments and technologies and techniques that were used to build the bubble that caused the greatest financial disaster since the Great Depression. So, I
Okay,
mean,
okay. What did Paul Peltier tell us a couple of days ago that revealed this 2 weeks before everybody else did on our weekly discussion with the new Untouchables? And he was the former,
oh yeah, the
uh,
missing money.
yeah, right. That came from Tower Financial. That, as it turns out, was a Ponzi scheme. And as it turns out, we're looking at there's 1.5 billion completely missing from the sort of forensics, if you will, of all things Epstein. Now, beyond that, just as a sidebar, I want to mention that I find it really fascinating in terms of the follow the money part of Epstein. And I've been listening to a lot of this stuff kind of drip, drip, drip recently, but I've been thinking about this really going back, I think, to 2017 when people started first asking questions when Epstein was arrested the second time, when he ends up going into, under Trump's first term and then was disappeared, right? But you've got this guy out of your neck of the woods in Columbus, Ohio, a gentleman by the name of Les Wexner,
Mhm.
and his claim to fame, at least front facing, was the fact that he was, the creator of the and the brilliance, the genius, the money, the engineering of the business model, and so on and so forth. From everything from like I'm trying to think of all the companies, but Victoria's Secret's the biggest one. But there was a lot
Yeah,
of
the
retail.
limited and
The
some
limited,
other,
yeah.
yeah.
So he was
Mhm.
huge, right? Now, as it turns out, I've learned that, oh, yeah, their family was pretty much connected to a lot of questionable characters in organized crime long before that, by the way. Okay.
Mm.
And so, when you really do hit the rewind on all this stuff, I mean, first of all, just to finish my thought on Les Wexner, the guy handed over power of attorney to a
Right.
guy who didn't have a college degree that teaches math at the Dalton School with access, and it just so happens that his principal or general, what do they called it if private schools? I'm trying to think of the kind of the equivalent of the.
Hadn't he just got fired from like Bear Stearns, or
Well,
was
that was
that
next.
after?
That was
Right.
next. But
Oh,
but
that was okay.
but when he was at the Dalton School, he was hired by last name was Barr, and this guy was the father of William Barr. William Barr, who became the Attorney General during the Trump administration, but whose bones go back to Bush during Iran Contragate. So that's all money laundering. And that's all the kind
Right,
of stuff
right,
that was
right.
okay. I love to see your reaction there because that was, going back in the way back machine. But this is how relevant all this stuff is because everybody is mostly interested in the cover up right now, right? It's the cover up, it's the cover up, it's the cover up. And so you follow the money and you start to think to yourself, okay, you hear like little rumors here and there that Wexner had a thing for Wexler, sorry, Les Wexler, yeah,
Les Wexner.
Wexner, sorry. Sounds like a character right out of Gotham, doesn't it? But
Right,
and
right.
it really blows my mind that so many of these pathways that we've discovered are oddly from Ohio. But I'll get back to that in a minute because you relocated there, and that's a story in itself. But it's like I don't know any billionaire that even if they had some sort of infatuation with someone or they were in love with somebody and they had, an affair and how deep it went in their heart with, that would sign over a multi-billion-dollar operation with power of attorney to give a guy like Epstein, who, as you're right, and this is kind of the chronology of the whole thing. Epstein comes out of Dalton, ends up going to Lehman Brothers, where he learns all sorts of offshoring techniques in terms of high asset
Was it Lehman or Bear Stearns?
did I say Bear Stearns? Because I meant Lehman. It was Lehman.
I thought it was Bear Stearns, but
Oh, he was at,
whatever.
okay. Well,
Yeah.
okay. Hey, man, tomato, tomato. In that case, right?
Right,
What those
right, right,
guys are
right.
both up to. But the bottom line is, he was managing portfolios of high net worth individuals in terms of offshoring. Okay, which we've had since the '80s, and it's just gotten more and more and more. But like I told you, the spy side of it. When you think of Bill Barr's father, you think about Contragate, you think about money laundering, you think about all of these things and it's impossible. And I could go on in terms of all of the other elements that are coming out by the day in terms of the money. But it's like nobody does this stuff with a sure thing or there's some sort of leverage. There's some sort of like you're a made guy on this whole thing. We're
Right.
talking about billions of dollars, dude. Okay, which would otherwise, I mean, when they've looked at some of the forensics and the money that went to the let's call it girls. I mean, it was horrible to think about this in Paris, New York, Florida, wherever else, the obviously the island. We're talking about, I think we've seen so far somewhere in the $300 million range. This this thing had billions of dollars into it. And by the way, included none other than JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, some of the country's largest hedge fund guys, and private equity guys. So you and I have gone down this, let's call it a honey trap of its own. Not to, I mean, but the bottom line is we discovered the Ark and Stone by way of what is money? Where does the money come from? What is control fraud? What is leverage and manipulation? All of these things. And the point that I'm getting at with all of these variables is that, my God, when you consider, I'm trying to think about the analogy and the way to get in here, but I want to do it this way. This is how I want to do it. Okay, look, the victims are, we do have to recognize the victims. So I offer, for example, the country needs to wrap their heads around the name Addie Polk. You discovered Addie Polk, a woman who shot herself in the chest 5 times for being thrown out of her house that she had lived in over 4 decades, that we had discovered later, and we could talk writ large about straw buying and all sorts of documentation fraud and other things that set her up when she was just trying to tell the officers, the sheriffs that were coming to evict her, that there was a mistake, that she owned her house and some other things, right? But the bottom line was she was forced into a absolutely horrific. I mean, I can't even find the words to get inside the head of what she had to do to make that fateful decision in context to not being aware of a big picture thing that had victimized her. She was literally set up, kind of like these young girls, right? Think about it from a standpoint that, okay, they want to be around access to power. They didn't come from a lot of money, some of them. Hey, here's all of these things where you can stay at a posh place, you're on jet planes and everything else. All you have to do is these acts that we're now, horrified by decades later, right? But in context to the analogy that I'm making to have you riff on, is that liar's loans that we discovered were a honey trap of their own, right? It was like, hey, you don't have extra money for your medications. You live on a fixed income. You got to end up paying X amount of thousands of dollars to get, because the
Right.
cities were saying,
They're swooping in with the answer.
yeah, and they got this answer. And it's like, hey, all you got to do, your house is worth this much more. That's the entrapment. Here's the dangle and the kind of, I can solve all your problems. All you have to do is come in and sign this up. And what it led to in the case of Addie Polk was this death sentence. I've always thought that it was they through Addie and our work, the kind, that it's the revelation. For example, I think I brought that up, this analogy the other day, of like a lot of people are going to be like, who killed Epstein? We know who killed the American dream because of this unbelievable, god awful tragedy that Addie went through. But that was this path to like unbelievable resolution, because she led us to the fact that, because of your neck of the woods that you also discovered and we discovered together, happenstance, was that the Summit County, Ohio, under the leadership of then Attorney General Mark Dann, was the only place in the country and the world with the largest racketeering story in the history of the world. It was a global scenario that we end up uncovering. They were the only ones in the country that were able to do an investigation, find out who was doing what, when, and how, bring the indictment, bring the evidence, and get RICO convictions of something that we later learned should have happened to the entirety of our financial system.
Sure.
Same financial system that's involved with all things Epstein at the moment. Please, riff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the secret sauce of the Summit County Task Force story, right? In that you had a bunch of guys, none of which knew anything about finance or mortgages, were able to find what they needed in order to get a successful criminal prosecution on dozens of counts. And nothing they did is anything that couldn't have been done from the Department of Justice. Department of Justice would have had far more resources to build even more robust prosecutions if they tried. And ultimately, that's what we saw, right? The big sin of the Obama administration was that they didn't even try. Um, And why not? I mean, not I don't know, but they didn't is the bottom line.
Eric, Eric,
And there's
Eric,
a straight line from that decision to not prosecute to the discord that we're in today.
do we now know, or at least let's say three-quarters of us in this country, that the Department of Justice under Donald Trump and Pam Bondi is completely corrupt? Looking
Oh,
at Ghislaine Maxwell and what Todd Blanche just did, and what we see as an absolute cover up, is there anybody in the world who doesn't see the Department of Justice is nakedly corrupt?
right, right. Well, I had this conversation a couple of weeks ago. Actually, no, it was one of my personal posts where I was saying that one of the biggest differences that we're seeing now is that we saw passive corruption, right, in the Department of Justice before,
Wait, can I
where
add this? Can I add this real quick? Just real quick, because
sure,
this is the point that I want you to chime in on, though, because see, this is what my point is. It's nakedly corrupt now.
right, right,
His point was what we're talking about is shadow corruption. But let me just add this really quick. There were tens of millions of people that went down the same path as Addie Polk in way of getting involved with liars loans that became liars derivatives that blew up the whole world, that blew up countries, that blew up counties, that blew up pensions, that blew up tens of millions of people that we then backdoored tens of trillions of dollars illegally. But none of that happens. None of that happens if the Department of Justice does its job. And so what you're just about to lay out is what passive or shadow corruption. I mean,
well, right, right. Well, what I was gonna say is that, the passive corruption is from the Obama era was basically the corruption of letting stuff happen. What's different today is that it's active corruption, where they're actually doing the corrupt act themselves. And that is like, I mean, as bad as it was, and it was horrible. I mean, let's not, mince words. Passive corruption is just as horrible and just as whatever as anything else. But there is a line that's being crossed when it is the actual Department of Justice that is doing the act of criminality themselves. And I think that's what we're seeing.
right. But what I've said all along, Eric, since well, I don't know if it's when we started, but it evolved over time. It occurred to me because you know that my North Star is I'm anti fascist. I mean, fascism to me is the end all be all that I've been battling in my mind and my heart and my soul my entire life. I do not accept fascism. But what the point of this domino is corruption births and fuels fascism. And so when you're talking about an active DOJ, an FBI that is nakedly corrupt. We just saw through the big beautiful bill that we've got ICE and detention camps, and we could use these 70s like Burt Reynolds kind of motifs in alligator Alcatraz or bear Alcatraz. Those are concentration camps designed to basically, without habeas corpus, without due process, what makes it, guys, what I'm trying to say and elicit to everybody is that, to Eric's point, passive acceptance of corruption leads to fascism in the end of the fucking.
Right. It leads to active corruption. I mean, 100%. I mean, I think that that is, really to kind of go back to the thing you were talking about where it's like fascism is dependent on corruption. It is because in in order to get to the point to where the government is taking over the things that it's taking over, it has to corrupt the political system. And by corrupting the political system, it allows you to corrupt the government. And when you corrupt the government, you tear down all the different things that prevent that kind of consolidation of power, right? So fascism requires that form of corruption. Now, how does this whole thing get funded? Well, that's the corporate style of corruption, right? I mean, it all plays hand in hand with each other. But yeah, you cannot get to a fascist government without corruption completely riddling the economy, the culture, and society.
And it all depends on lies. As we've discussed week in and week out, it's just simply lies. And we as a society throughout most of our lives aren't surprised that people in power will lie to protect themselves. But what I believed in before we got started, which led to this entire journey, that odyssey that you and I have been on, was that I believed in the system. I thought the system had integrity. I thought there would be no way in hell to have systemic corruption. Boy, was I wrong after, now you and I, 13 years on this odyssey. But I do want to say this because, and I think we should just, I think we've made the points. We could talk 100 years about this stuff. In fact, we do every day and all day with our work, and we've got, and we'll plug that in a second. But Eric, you and I have gone the distance. Okay, we've got answers that the entirety of media has hit. And so, what I want to point out to the people that are watching in real time, somebody like Aaron Burnett, right, of CNN, suddenly have, or really anybody at MSNBC, have incredible interests in all things that are Epstein, because quite frankly, it's politically expedient. And again, I recognize
Right.
that I want the stories of the victims told, so much so that we get the full picture. I don't want to stop at the victims, because they're a gateway, like Addie Polk's horrific story, into the reason why they became victims. Because there was a reason. It wasn't just
Right.
because old guys were getting off on this thing. It was because they were leveraging people, like you said earlier, and that's why there's billions of dollars in this, right? And so, for me, though, I went further after we released our work in 2020, and now we have kind of a re-engineering of trying to get things out there and make the case. And I'll always make the case that if you think that it's okay, like a lot of people think that they know what happened in the 2008 crisis. They don't. They don't know that it never ended. And they don't know the depths of the depravity. And they don't have any idea how many tens of trillions of dollars were backdoored illegally to the system that engineered this whole thing. When people talk about the billionaires, Bernie Sanders, hey, we've got to tax them, we've got to rein them in, they can't be above the law. When people are talking about now the sudden revelation that, oh yeah, there's two systems of law. There's one for all of us, and then there's one where the guys above the line can't be held accountable for anything. Let alone, I mean, this is as salacious as it gets. Hey, there's got to be there. There were cameras in every bedroom and bathroom at every Epstein estate, from Paris to Mar-a-Lago to the island. They've got the information, right? That was the whole purpose of these guys. But what I'm telling you is, and we cannot forget this, is that if you want to understand why the billionaires have so much control, it's not just because of Epstein. That's a part of it. The bigger picture is what we're revealing. They've spent decades destroying the middle class, smash and grab thievery that nobody understands, because they're above the law and the law is complicit in this mammoth global corruption.
Well, to me, the salient question is, and I think this is another way of saying what you just said, is that what is the truth that is so dangerous that you have this whole Epstein scheme put in place in order to protect it? That to me is the question.
Follow the money. Follow the money. Always follow the money. And it is amazing to me. I can own my final thought on this. We had an amazing. I mean, in addition to the absolute, I feel so blessed, Eric, that we went so far to discover so many truth tellers that were professionals, not just people that something happened to you, but people that were in the system at the highest levels of the DOJ, the highest levels of the FBI, and so on and so forth, to reveal these things that just when you add it up, it's like, oh my God, it's a total, it's elementary, my dear Watson, right? And it's so simple once you understand the pattern. But for me, the one guy that we haven't been able to express more, even though I know they exist on the drives in your office, but Dr. Phil Zimbardo. Dr. Phil Zimbardo addressed this stuff all the time. I wonder if you can just kind of give your 2 cents at this moment to kind of close this out on what we learned from Dr. Zimbardo.
Well, the area of work of Dr. Zimbardo's that we dug into, and that later I read the book. It was a magnificent book. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, The Lucifer Effect, is that it talks about how good people basically get caught in evil circumstances and how the people at the top are able to get otherwise good people to do incredibly evil acts. And that's kind of the Lucifer effect. And the way that we've always talked about it is that the Lucifer effect, and this is going to be highly jargony, but I mean, kind of leads to the Gresham's dynamic, right? Um, because if the law or regulation doesn't stop a corrupt company from doing what it's doing, then it just spreads, like a disease, throughout a particular industry and perhaps throughout an entire, economy. But the Lucifer effect in particular, an awful lot of that is sort of like the how when you create how did he put it? The way that he liked to do is that he liked to talk about it in terms of apples and apple barrels, in that there's this idea that, oh, that person's just a bad apple, the one person that they happen to toss in jail. And it's just like, well, bad apples don't come from anywhere. It's like they usually come from bad barrels, right? And so you go up the food chain to the bad barrel. And you say, well, you know what? Bad barrels don't come from anywhere. They come from a bad barrel maker. And if you look at like the 2008 financial crisis, okay, so you might have like that completely fraudulent, loan broker who's going door to door in some poor neighborhood in Columbus or Cleveland or Akron, right? And lying, cheating, stealing, whatever, doing whatever that person needs to do in order to get that unwitting person to sign on the dotted line. And sometimes if they won't sign on the dotted line, they'll just go and sign up for them. That was something that we came across, in the con. So that might be a
Falsifying business
right,
records to the tunes of tens of millions.
right. Now that loan broker would be considered the bad apple. Where'd that loan broker come from? He came from a place like Ameriquest, right? Or like Countrywide, which is the bad barrel, right? Because what did they do? They incentivized everything within their shop to make sure that the people who were rewarded the most were the people who do anything to get that mortgage. Perverse incentives, right? But Countrywide didn't act alone. There had to be a bad barrel maker. That's where Wall Street came in, right? They're the ones who basically funded all these non-bank lenders. None of them had their
Starting
own
with whom,
money.
by the way? Do you remember who the first guys in the trenches were on this in terms of the warehouse lines?
Ah, geez. A pop quiz. It's like I know I should know this
Well,
after all the
it's because it's relevant to what we talked about earlier. It was Lehman. Lehman were
Lehman,
the
right,
first
right,
of the
right, right,
people.
yeah. Yeah,
And,
and they were the most aggressive too.
where did Jeffrey Epstein learn his craft?
Right. Right, right during that
Among other
time.
things, yeah.
Right during that time. And so yeah, you know what? That ultimately is how a corrupt individual uses incentives to corrupt an entire system, right? An entire company, an entire industry gets corrupted that way, and yeah, I mean,
And you just
absent regulation and absent like any kind of meaningful law enforcement,
you
that's
get
exactly what's going to
fascism. In
happen.
the end, you get fascism. That's what happens. You've got the law for the few and law and order and these lies and hypocrisy and lie, deny, switch the blame and implicate. But I mean, people, you
All right.
go ahead. You want to finish your thought?
Well, yeah, no, I was just going to say you're exactly right because what's the end result of this? I mean, well, there's many end results, but one of them, is the wealth gap, wealth inequality, right? I mean, they keep on accruing all this money, all this money, all this money. And so what do you do when you have all this money? You buy up everything that you possibly can, which means that you and I are priced out of everything, right? And so we can't go and lobby. They can. Not only can they lobby, they can out and out buy a politician. They can twist the entire system to their benefit because they have all this excess money that they have nothing better to do with.
That's right. And it's all predicated on lies. Okay, a whole industry via lies. That's why it's beyond the capacity of most people to understand. That's why you have to follow the crumbs of the yellow brick road to be able to understand this, that we've been able to provide to the American people for free. If you want to understand the blueprint of truth, it's in the con that you can find at thecon.tv. And what I want see the way I feel about this at the moment is this is the parting of the Red Sea because finally people from Doge, and through all of these things that are happening with Epstein, this crazy, we'll call it genocide in different theaters around the world, and many other things that are coming to the fore. The question is, who's getting away with this, and why? Who's got the power? Why are they above the law? That's what's emerging. That's what's emerging. Eric and I have spent 13 years discovering the answers that we have presented to you for free. And I say that all the American people buy our lies. And it's time for a reckoning where the truth creates this massive cleanse because the media was in on it, your government was in on it. And this is a key consideration that Eric has always reminded me from the very beginning, right? It's that, look, our institutions were in on it. That doesn't mean the institutions are corrupt. There are thousands of people that worked at the Department of Justice for decades that are pros, many of whom have quit because of Trump. And I never want to say that was a heroic move, because if you quit and you just open up the ability for Trump to further corrupt and put his minions in there, what good does that do? But the point that I'm trying to make is that there were always thousands of professionals in our institutions that were doing the good work. But all it takes is one misplaced bad apple in this particular situation at the apex of the agencies that are created to prevent all of this from happening. And you can
Right.
see what happens. I mean, people
A
are talking about
well-placed
Merrick
political
Garland right now. Sorry.
appointee, yeah, a well-placed political appointee can introduce rot into an entire system.
If you were to ask any of the victims, especially those who went to the New York Times and CNN and MSNBC and whomever 20 years ago, right? Could Epstein have been stopped if those in the positions of power actually listened to them? Could he have been stopped?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing.
That's the
All of these
thing.
people can be stopped. We've seen it. We've done it before. That's what the SNL crisis showed. Even Enron,
Exactly.
to a certain extent, has proven that yes, we can stop these people. We can put them in jail where they belong, and we can stop that particular criminal scourge. We've done it.
If the law does what the law is supposed to do, if the law is not corrupted, the democracy that we don't have anymore, and it's going to get worse because of all of the election engineering and the fraud that I see all the time coming from. Ironically, he's a genius on that front, Mark Elias. But Mark Elias is tied at the hip with Eric Holder. None of this happens. None of this happens, in my opinion, if Eric Holder didn't basically play ball, and same with Barack Obama. And see, the irony here is, right, and this is probably going to disturb the DNC, or I see him all the time, DNC trolls, or people that are like, you can't criticize Obama, right? Obama is this guy that, he's the white knight, he's on the white horse, he's this guy that is just the antithesis. He gets underneath Donald Trump's skin because Donald Trump, he's more popular, and he's obviously more intelligent and charismatic and all of the other things that they want to use in these high school sort of jargon, which is probably true when it comes to Trump because he's such a freaking debilitated idiot moron. I mean, and he is the expression of the worst parts of what our country has become. And yet, here is Donald Trump, ironically, saying that Obama had committed treason for documentation fraud. That's ridiculous. Obama didn't do the tens of millions of documentation fraud that the entire financial industry did. He only let them get away with it.
Right. Right. Yeah, which because we know that Trump was involved with these things, right?
Right.
That he basically let Trump get away with it.
Yes.
It's
And
like if anything, he should be thanking Obama.
right. And so here's another completely lost opportunity. So right before the election, Donald Trump was literally on the verge of his seventh bankruptcy. Why? Because he owed the state of New York $450 million. Why? Because Letitia James, who was on it in a great case against Donald Trump's documentation fraud, falsification of business records, and appraisal fraud. But what she ended up doing was stopping short of going to the bank, which was actually in on it in this case with Deutsche Bank, which, by the way, goes from Putin and long-term capital management right into Trump. So what we're trying to tell you is that the story of now is the story of the last 20, 30 years, quite frankly. And if you open up the gate, just like Addie Polk, unfortunately, through this tragedy, her tragedy, to us, became a miracle. She led us to understand that what we're talking about is the failure of law, the failure of the professionals in the system, thanks to corruption that has destroyed the institutions. And I'll finish with this, Eric. We all know that a plane can't fly without the integrity of the system. A ship is not going to float without the integrity of the system. If you want to see beyond comprehension wrecks and deaths and calamity, let's keep doing what we're doing to where they, basically manufacture brakes so that insurance companies, get claims because, or in some, sort of twisted way, some sort of government bailout for tens of thousands of people's brakes giving out. I mean, that's how ridiculous this is. And the last point. When you look at what happened in terms of the bailouts, people, the guys that engineered the calamity, they got paid 10x what the downside was, and they bought our government. They're all the same people
Right.
who are in control.
Right. No, no, no. No, that's 100% true. I mean, like I've said before, we're evidently, quote unquote, $37 trillion in debt. I know I don't have any of it, right? That debt is basically just the federal government putting that money into the economy. That's all that is. But I know I don't have any of it, right? But we do know who does because they're the ones who are buying everything, right?
How? Because of what
Now,
we're laying out.
right? And
Let's
it's
not forget that Americans are also in $33 trillion of personal debt.
all right, to whom? I
The
mean,
state.
it's not an accident that it's probably not an accident. I mean, I don't know, but it's probably not an accident that those numbers are so close, right? Because I mean, without getting into the weeds on this whole thing, I mean, debt from a bank is basically somebody else's asset, right? Right? So if I have a mortgage, that's a debt for me. That's an asset to somebody on the other side, right? And ultimately, it's like they're going to have all the money from that, or I'm going to default, they're going to foreclose, and they're going to have not only the money that they've been collecting, but now they're going to have the other asset, the actual physical home as well. And how often did that happen in the wake of the financial crisis? I mean, the transfer of wealth was breathtaking. And I don't even think people realize just how much that was. And I hear a lot of, you know, we'll just say people who represent the interests of the corrupt billionaires, the oligarchy, um, bandy about the term, class war. It's like, oh, it's like all these poor people are trying to like have a class war. That's really rich coming from them, given the fact that they basically, in this class war, are the holders of all of the nuclear bombs and have used them time and again.
In the form of roofing their victims, roofing, I should say, in a freak off on the American middle class because of all this obfuscation of the law. Because look, people, you gotta wake up. This isn't woke. In fact, Eric and I'll never forget. Everybody's heard so much about woke, and that's been a thing for the MAGAs and anti woke and yada yada yada. But we started off this journey working together, even though we worked together before this. But on this documentary that we produced, where we got a chance to go to Zuccotti Park during the Occupy Wall Street movement, and I laid most of this stuff out, not nearly as much detail as we have now, of course, because we were going with our gut and what we learned on the first lap around the country. But I stood in front of, probably thousands of people in Zuccotti Park the day the
Yeah, it's
NYPD
heavy. Yeah.
blew it down. And Eric was right there filming me at that moment. And I said, I laid out the story that we had at that time. And I said, this is all in purpose to get, the tens of thousands that came to the street that woke up, and we need to get tens of millions of people to wake up. We don't live in a democracy, people. We live in a corporate fascist state. Eric always likes to tell me that that's redundant. We live in a corporate fascist state that's undergirded by a criminal syndicate. That's what we've been telling you this whole time. They're a criminal syndicate that acts like the mafia. I call them the mafiocracy. And they literally blew up the world with the largest racketeering grift in the history of the world. And they also own the revolving door. For those of you who want to, decry Citizens United, that's a huge part of this. That's part of the inside game that allows this to happen. But when they blew up the world, this is the biggest piece of this puzzle, right? They didn't go down. They didn't go down because we're also, as much as we're not a democracy, we don't have capitalism. Now, I know that we could debate and we could discuss and we could go into the nuances of definitions and we could go into the whole mammoth, understanding of the last, let's call it 50 years from neoliberalism and what that construes in economics. But capitalism is supposed to be risk reward. If you fail, you go down. If you break the law, if you have the law, you're supposed to go down. Neither of those things happen. Instead, the full faith and credit of the United States went to provide tens of trillions of dollars to the tiny, tiny cabal of this financial system that operates as the mafiocracy. And now they're creating fascism. Literally, this isn't, I'm not warning you about fascism. You've seen it for the past
Well,
3 months. Go ahead.
absolutely. I was just going to say, no, you're right, because I mean, why does fascism occur? Fascism occurs when the people who basically have an untenable amount of capital are trying their damnedest to hold on to it because otherwise they can't.
Wow, going back to leverage and how they do it and the dirty games people play to be able to make sure that they're in the know. And again, that's what this is. I mean, Wall Street we learned this when we were in New York the first time, and it always blew my mind when I heard this the first time when we were talking, when everybody on the street was talking about, especially when we went to when we were doing interviews on Wall Street, when they were talking about, what's the term, Eric, when the capitalism doesn't work and you bail out the bad guys, or you just bail out people who failed. It's come on, man. We both know this term like it's the back of our hand. It'll come to me in a minute. I couldn't think of it the other day, and as soon as I push off, I know it's going to come to me.
Right, right, right.
But they all know it. All of the insiders know it because at that time, who was our former? This is how I'll get there, because it was the Volcker rule that they were trying to impart after the great financial crisis, because they knew they had to do what you discovered at the very beginning and what we learned later from Lloyd Blankfein. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. They didn't have the positions, and they, through all of the racketeering elements of control fraud, they created this thing where they could bet both sides of the house. And when the house of cards fell, the government was there to provide the billions and billions and trillions overall to the guys that did that. And that's called, I keep thinking of plausible deniability. That's not what I'm trying to think. Moral hazard, moral
Well, right.
hazard, moral hazard, which is a nice way. It's a very, the kind of people that wear, the criminals in suits with no shame, that they created this Orwellian term to where what that means is they can destroy the world with crime and racketeering, and they're above the law. And we're going to provide them tens of trillions of dollars to do what Eric said at the beginning in terms of the wealth inequality, the wealth gap. It's the exact same thing. So listen, man, we could talk forever. I'm gonna call it good right there. I'm gonna say, please, everybody, check out my good friend Eric Vaughn on Corruption Incorporated, The American Way. You can find it on Instagram, obviously YouTube. I know that you've been all over Facebook. Any other?
And TikTok.
And TikTok, absolutely. I love the stuff where you point above your head to like the headlines,
Right.
and you blow all of this stuff up. And then, of course, I would encourage everybody to check out the Clean New Deal at thecleannewdeal.org. But more importantly, please check out the Con at thecon.tv, which will give you an insight that the $90 billion apparatus of our Department of Justice, FBI, SEC, state AGs around the country didn't do on behalf of the American people, while the media lied to you, just like they did with Epstein. On that note, thanks guys for tuning in. We'll talk to you guys later. Take care.